Buenas tardes a todos. Soy Mariana Campero y por cortesía con nuestros invitados... Por cortesía con nuestros invitados voy a cambiar a inglés. Para aquellos que lo necesiten, tenemos traducción simultánea. Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Mariana Campero, and I am the Executive Director of COMEXI, the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations. In COMEXI, we have spent a lot of time trying to understand the threats and challenges undermining the global trading system, but also how the changes in U.S. trade policies will and are affecting Mexico, not only from an economic perspective, but also from a political one. And as the negotiations in Washington are still underway, and to help us better understand the consequences of a new agreement, if we have one, the political timelines in each country, and more importantly, the potential impact on the North American project, it is my privilege to welcome some of the world's leading experts on trade and 4 of the people that created NAFTA, an agreement that was recently described as one of the most successful undertakings of economic cooperation in the Americas. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Carla Hills, John Weeks, Mr. John Weeks, a Senior Business Advisor of Bennett & Jones in Ottawa, Dr. Jaime Serra Puche, and Dr. Luis de la Calle. Thank you very much for being with us today, and welcome. Welcome to Mexico, Ambassador Hills and John. I will not read to you their full bios, but you do have them in the little sheets of paper that you have, each of you in your seats. Today's agenda will consist on a 10-minute presentation from each of our panelists, followed by a conversation with Luis de la Calle. After that, we will open the floor to your Q&A. And before we start, I just would like to thank Chubb, HSBC, Union Pacific, Baker McKinsey, Ferrero Rocher for making this happen. Also, I would like to thank all of our members and COMEXI friends, and would like to thank all of you for being with us today. I am sure this conversation will be very, very interesting. Thank you very much, and welcome.
¿Ya están preparados? Voy a ver si nos sirven un poquito de agua o café. ¿Alguien quiere café?
Thank you.
Gracias. ¿A los 4?
Vente cerca.
A ver.
They want to take a picture next to you. Vente, Luis.
Oh. Should I stand up?
No, you're fine there. We're all...
You want us to stand up?
No,
there we go.
This is already a pain. Okay. That's it.
¿Listos?
Listos, yeah.
Ya todo.
You see,
Sí,
they
bueno.
have a nice present for you.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. Patty Kelly. We'll begin with the program. Before we do so, I'd like to, of course, thank Mariana Campero for putting this event together. As she mentioned in her initial remarks, this is very timely. As we have negotiations going on right now in Washington, D.C. on modernizing or renegotiating or transforming or revamping the North American Free Trade Agreement. I'd like also to thank COMEXI for putting together and bringing to Mexico three of the key peoples that made NAFTA a reality more than 25 years ago. I think Mexico has been very lucky to count as our friends, Carla Hills and John Weeks. They were, I wouldn't say that they were our adversaries when we negotiated NAFTA, more colleagues working on a common project. But they have proven to be friends of NAFTA, friends of North America, and friends of Mexico ever since. We have seen Carla Hills in Mexico many times over in the last 25 years, always defending the wisdom of the very ambitious project we undertook almost 30 years ago. She was recently here at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce AmCham meetings talking about NAFTA. And the same is true for John Weeks. John Weeks has been is a very well-known international trade negotiator with a distinguished career in Geneva and, of course, Ottawa, Brussels, and a good friend of Mexico, truly committed to North American integration. And, of course, Jaime Serra, well, you know him very well. Jaime is from Mexico's, from the Mexican side, the founding father of NAFTA. His leadership, his commitment, his wisdom, his hard work. I was privileged to work with him for some years back then on this, and I think we are very fortunate that we can benefit from the ideas they may have on how they've seen the NAFTA so far and where it might go, and the difficulties this negotiation encounters as compared to what we did 25 years ago. The timing is important because there is a sense, at least in Mexico and Washington, Mexico City and Washington, that we need to finish this agreement soon. The reason for that thinking is related to the political calendars. In the US, there is an election in November. There's expectation that there might be an uncertain outcome in terms of who might win the House, potentially the Senate in the US. And the US administration has been thinking that if they want to have this agreement approved by the current Congress, they will need to finish by mid-May. Otherwise, under TPA, the Trade Promotion Authority, it would be legally and politically impossible to have a vote in 2018. On the Mexican side, of course, we have elections, a very important election on July 1st. And the government has been trying to finish the negotiations in such a way that we minimize the uncertainty that exists naturally when you have revisions of the NAFTA at the same time, as we have an election cycle. But the government has also been clear, and I think that's very important, that in the end, it will be the substance that will drive the timing and not the political calendar that will decide where we might go. The NAFTA 25 years ago was successful because it was very ambitious. And we put the bar very high. The NAFTA was ambitious because it was a universal agreement with no exceptions on merchandise trade, with a negative list on services and investment, with a ratchet clause, and with new disciplines on intellectual property rights, government procurement, services, and many other aspects that had never been covered before, and full coverage, almost full coverage, with some exceptions in Canada, on agriculture. It was also a very important agreement because it was symmetric. Mexico, Canada, and the US have the same rights and the same obligations in spite of the fact that Mexico is a developing country. And the symmetry that we negotiated 25 years ago underpins the value of the NAFTA. For Mexico, I think we would have made a significant mistake by insisting that because we were a developing country, we had to have an asymmetric outcome. And symmetry is what protects Mexico now, because the US administration has framed this negotiation as we need to correct back NAFTA because the US is losing, and we therefore need an asymmetric agreement. And the NAFTA was also successful because it became a model for international trade negotiations worldwide. So the challenge for the second round of revisions of the NAFTA is, I think, one, to keep symmetry, and two, to make sure that anything we do will be as influential as the NAFTA we negotiated 25 years ago by raising the level of ambition and influence the rest of the world on the new areas that trade agreements should cover. But I mean, to learn about these things, we'll have Carla Hills first, then we'll move north to John Weeks, and we end up with some thoughts from Jaime Serra on the Mexican side. So please, Carla, why don't you give us your ideas as to what's going on in the NAFTA renegotiation?
Thank you, Luis. It's a great pleasure to join you, and I'm John's old friends, and it's wonderful to be part of the COMEXI gathering. So I thank you very much for having me here in Mexico. It's always a pleasure for me to be here. I have to say that we're living in troubled times, tumultuous times, politically and economically and technologically, and that's affecting our domestic, our bilateral, and our global relationships. Global institutions are under fire. They have created unprecedented peace and stability over the last 70 years, but they are under a siege like never before. Brexit, you all know about, the nationalist trend that is crossing Europe, and the 2016 presidential election in the United States are all evidence of this nationalism that is occurring. And in America, economic nationalism is now the TLCAN term used to describe our trade policy. In his inaugural address, President Trump stated, "We must protect our borders from the ravages of other countries, making our products, stealing our companies, destroying our jobs." And shortly after making those remarks, he withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Working hard on the renegotiation assignment of the North American Free Trade Agreement. In my view, knowing what the NAFTA accomplished is critical to making sound judgments when you're thinking about changing the agreement. And some of the things that were accomplished, Luis has already mentioned. But let me just say that by linking the three economies, we created a 90 million consumers. That better?
Yeah.
We eliminated tariffs on all industrial products and on most agricultural products. It opened up a broad range of services and provided national treatment for cross-border service providers. It removed significant investment barriers, ensuring basic protections for North American investors. and it was the first trade agreement to establish protection for copyright, patents, trade secrets, and it was the first trade agreement to create an effective mechanism to resolve trade disputes. Luis has mentioned that it was a model. The Uruguay round had collapsed within 4 months of completing the NAFTA. Then the 126 trade ministers came back to the table, finished the upgrade of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, created the WTO, picked up a copy of our provision to protect intellectual property, picked up a copy of our provision to protect investors, and created the World Trade Organization for dispute settlements. Also, as a result of our negotiation, inter-regional trade from China. And I would say all three economies have benefited enormously, but I'm here to talk about the United States. 14 million of our jobs depend upon our trade with Mexico and Canada. Canada today is our largest export market. Mexico is our second largest, and fully 1/3 of our global trade, our trade with the world, is with our northern and southern neighbors. But the benefits go far beyond trade. For the vibrancy of the economic bonds that we have created have greatly enhanced our people-to-people bonds and our strategic bonds. For example, visitors from Canada and Mexico constitute the two top sources of tourism. And in the United States, 1 out of 9 jobs is connected to tourism. Speaking about a strategy, our three nations work very closely together and share intelligence to reduce the reach of organized crime, improving security at our borders, and our collaboration enables us to facilitate and expedite legitimate commercial flows so that our governments can focus on the real dangers like terrorism. So it's overwhelmingly in our national interest to maintain and to build upon the vibrant commercial and security ties that have grown over the past 2 decades. As our business community says, implores us, do no harm. And no one denies that this agreement needs an update, for much has changed economically and technologically in the last 20 years. For example, there are things that all three of us could benefit from by upgrades. For example, broader protection of intellectual property would make a big difference, because digital content's absolutely essential to 21st century economy. Energy trade has multiplied since Mexico's 2004 reforms, and having rules covering North American energy would be a boon to all three economies. Also, taking advantage of the new technology, we could make customs processes far more efficient, which would be an enormous benefit for all of our businesses, particularly small and medium-sized businesses. And I could go on and on. But in my view, it is not in anyone's interest to be distracted by debates regarding bilateral trade deficits, or complicating the rules of origin governing automobiles that will only encourage our entrepreneurs to forego the benefit of NAFTA, or to incorporate a sunset provision after 5 years that would create uncertainty about the future of the NAFTA and chill inward investment. And so my hope is that we focus on the substantial concrete benefits that can flow to all three economies and update the NAFTA to ensure that North America maintains and builds on its close economic, strategic, and human bonds that have greatly enhanced our prosperity and stability. But we need to recognize that trade policy is not just about economics. It involves politics. And you might well ask, why do so many Americans hold a hostile view to trade? For the Pew Research Center has documented that a substantial minority, about 40%, believe that trade agreements are harmful to their well-being, their financial well-being. And I think there are two basic reasons. The first is a large number of American workers have anxiety about loss of jobs, stagnant wages, and growing economic inequality. And correcting this will require our government and the private sector to step up and work together to address this legitimate anxiety that exists in many of our communities. It is true that manufacturing jobs have decreased over the past 20 years, but the decline began in 1980, way before the NAFTA agreement. Today, owing to technological advances, U.S. factories are producing twice as much output with half as many workers. And so today, I can also say we have 6 million higher skilled, higher paying jobs that are unfilled. And many of these jobs only require 10 to 20 weeks of training. So rather than destroying our nation's competitiveness by turning inward, what we need to do is to put in effect an effective model that's structured for the economy of the 21st century, and that would require us to use the internet to have a better match between job seekers and job vacancies nationwide, to provide a stipend for relocation and support for those workers during the training period, and to establish a public-private partnership for the training with those companies that actually need these workers. The second reason that so many Americans are hostile to trade agreements is their lack of knowledge about the economic and security benefits that flow from our cross-border commerce. And we desperately need to get the facts out to our citizens. And I would say in all three countries, it's possible that the current negotiations of the NAFTA will break down. In that case, those of us who care about keeping our markets open and keeping the benefits of this agreement will need to find ways to encourage our three governments to make their way back to the negotiating table. And business groups like COMEXI, like the corporations represented here, think tanks, universities, and individuals that care about these issues have a role to play with the reach across the border and explaining why this matters, because this is a critical time. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay.
Thank you, Carla. Why don't we have now John Wicks?
Maybe you should give me, I don't know whether my microphone, can you hear me properly? All right, I won't, I'll put it here in case I need it. Well, thank you very much, and I must say a big thanks to COMEXI. You've done so many good things over the years. I remember being at an event 4 years ago celebrating the 20th anniversary of the NAFTA and having no idea that I'd be back here 4 years later and we'd be making the kind of speeches we're making right now. I'm going to begin. I never really believed then either that I would be as busy talking about NAFTA and working on NAFTA in the private sector as I am today. And I spend quite a bit of time now on being interviewed on television trying to help explain what it is that's going on and what might happen. The what might happen, of course, is the what might happen is more difficult than the what's actually going on. But one of the questions I'm asked quite frequently is, what are the differences between what you were doing back 25 years ago, and a bit more actually, and what's going on today, and what's the different situation. And I say, the first thing I say is that the situation was extremely different, because 25 years ago, the three heads of government had a common vision of what it was we were trying to achieve. They wanted us to achieve an agreement, and they wanted it to be as ambitious as possible in terms of liberalizing trade and rulemaking and opening the countries to investment. And that provided a sort of vision that we were all able to work towards. Secondly, we had excellent ministers. And Michael Wilson, who couldn't be here today, sends his best regards. And I think this created an environment when a problem came up in the negotiations, as they always do, of course. We approached it from the point of view of, how do we deal with this? How do we find a way to get around this? How do we respond to this? Rather than sort of saying, you know, if you don't agree to this, you know, we're out of here. And so I think that that's very important to note. And I agree entirely with what Carla Hills has just said about the benefits of the NAFTA. And it's interesting that in Canada, I certainly think that that's true. You know, when we were negotiating the NAFTA, really it was only the political party to which the government belonged that was fully in favor of it. The Liberal Party, which is now in power in Canada, was ambivalent. The Socialist Party was opposed to it. I think the polling showed that about 75 or 80% of Canadians thought it was not a good idea for us to be negotiating the NAFTA. And yet the government decided to proceed with it. This situation has changed dramatically. Now there are about 75 or 80% of Canadians think the NAFTA is good for Canada. The two leading political parties are both strongly in favor of it. Our Socialist Party is, I think, sort of in favor of it. At least they're not criticizing it. And even the unions, while they not particularly helpful in the way they kibitz around the sidelines of the negotiation, are clearly not saying that it would be a good thing if the agreement came to an end. But we really do find ourselves in an extraordinary situation now. I mean, who would have thought 4 years ago that it would be the United States which would be trying to rebalance the agreement and saying that if this is not successful, they would intend to withdraw from it. And I think this is having a number of effects, and let me just sort of reflect on what I think a couple of them are. One of them is that I think in a number of quarters that Trump's attacks on NAFTA, because that's what he's doing and it continues, have actually made NAFTA more popular. They certainly made it more popular in Canada. I think probably that's been the case in Mexico. And I was on a panel last fall with Mike Froman, the former United States Trade Representative under President Obama. And he said that Trump had managed to do something that the Democrats had never managed to do while Obama was in office, and that was to make NAFTA popular with Democrats. Now, I don't know how deep that runs, but it's an interesting reflection. So let's just look a little bit. It's, you know, the timing of this event is fortuitous in one sense, because we're clearly at a critical part in the place in the negotiations. And Marianne, I don't think you could have forecast exactly how critical it would be. You know, parts of the negotiation have been going reasonably well, and parts of it are clearly not going very well. So I think when you look at the so-called rebalancing, and this is a very strange notion, this notion that's already been alluded to, that somehow or another the United States got a bad deal in the original negotiations because they were duped. I must say, I never thought it was easy negotiating with Carla Hills and Jules Katz. But anyway, this is part of the storyline now, but I certainly don't subscribe to any of that. And but the notion that because the United States has a trade deficit with Mexico, it now needs to rebalance the agreement, and with Canada too. Although, you know, I don't think trade balances really matter in the sense in which we're talking about it now, but we actually do have a balance in trade with the United States, more or less. In fact, a slight deficit if you include services trade and goods trade. But of course, that doesn't stop President Trump from declaring that they have a large trade deficit with Canada. So it's all in a sort of fantasy world. But the proposals are alarming. And, you know, I mean, the negotiations on the rules of origin in automobiles are, of course, partly about rebalancing the NAFTA. And it does perhaps make sense to be having a discussion about the rules of origin in that sector, because if you go back and look at the tracing list that we agreed in the NAFTA for what the components should be that went into an automobile, the automobiles are made out of entirely different components now. So in a sense, the rules of origin of the original NAFTA become kind of meaningless. But I think we need to be very careful in completing this negotiation to make sure that we don't create a rules of origin system in the automobile sector that actually winds up making the North American automobile less competitive on a global basis. And so I think we need to be very careful on that front. And then there are two, which I really think are the most egregious of the rebalancing proposals. The so-called sunset clause, the notion that the NAFTA would terminate every 5 years unless the three governments were to agree to give it another lease of life. This is crazy and goes against the whole notion of predictability that a trade agreement is supposed to establish. And then, of course, there's this notion that the dispute settlement parts of the NAFTA should either be removed or weakened so that they become merely advisory. And that, again, is nonsense. If you're going to have a trade agreement that provides rules that are going to be followed by the three countries, you have to provide adequate measures to ensure that those rules can be respected. And if you dilute that, again, it makes the agreement basically meaningless. And I think in a sense what lies behind this is a kind of notion, and perhaps articulated best by the United States Trade Representative, Ambassador Lighthizer, that basically he wants to create a situation in which there's no incentive to invest in Canada or in Mexico, and all the investment would go in the United States. Well, that's not a very, of course that's not going to be good for the United States. And I think one of the most astonishing things is both Canada, well, this isn't astonishing, Canada and Mexico have done a lot of work in the United States with various allies in the business community, in the Congress, in state governments, in academic institutions, trying to explain and build up support for the NAFTA and for the idea of renewing the NAFTA in a way that will actually strengthen it for the future rather than undermine it. And this has been, I think, quite successful. But what we've noticed in the process of this, and also, is that a lot of Americans have actually had to sit down and think, if the NAFTA is really under threat from this administration, maybe we'd better think about what would that mean for us. And so I think a lot of people, some who even voted for Donald Trump in the last election, a lot of farmers in the Midwest, have now come to the realization that actually if NAFTA disappeared, it could be very bad for their business and their investments. And this has been a positive development because over many years the NAFTA had largely been neglected politically, kind of ignored, although it was having a major effect in strengthening the North American economy. And I think what's now happening is a lot of Americans are beginning to realize that actually maybe this agreement is more important to them than they had appreciated in the recent past. It's too bad. Maybe Carla, you should have gone after me. Could comment on that. And I must say, Lighthizer seems kind of impervious to these views. And I never thought I'd live to see the day that a United States Trade Representative, and particularly a Republican one, would say that he didn't care what the business community thought. I mean, this is crazy. Anyway, I think we are, the Canada and Mexico are in a very difficult position because we're negotiating with the administration of Donald Trump and Ambassador Lighthizer, who have these extreme views on what it is they'd like to do. A number of positive modernization things as well, but I think the really worrying part are these rebalancing efforts. And I think we need to recognize that while we're actually negotiating with the administration, we have to keep in mind this much larger partnership that we have with the United States more generally, with the American business community, with the Congress, with potential future administrations. And we need to think about that as we're finalizing this negotiation, because we must craft an agreement that is going to respond to future challenges and be durable for the long term, just as the NAFTA, the one that we created 25 years ago, has served us very well. Yes, it can be improved, but let's not destroy it. Now, let me say a few words about Canada, because I'm Canadian, obviously, and you're probably expecting that. I think one of the things that gives me a lot of pleasure, because I think it was very enjoyable to participate in really the original NAFTA negotiations, as Canada and Mexico really began to find each other as partners and work together in cooperation. And it gives me pleasure to watch again today to see how Canada and Mexico are working very closely in these difficult circumstances with the common objective of trying to preserve the NAFTA and strengthen it and avoid it being turned into a, could I call it a bad NAFTA. I've already talked about the political support in Canada for the NAFTA, and there's a lot of goodwill for the government in terms of trying to negotiate a good agreement. And I think in the process of that, Canada would be prepared to make certain concessions, but we're not prepared to be the one to start making all the concessions if we don't see any real signs of flexibility from the United States. And we recognize very clearly that whatever it is that's negotiated is going to have to be a win-win-win agreement, so that there are political benefits in all three countries. It's not clear that Donald Trump appreciates the fact that both Mexico and Canada also actually have political constituencies that we have to respond to domestically. And if we are successful in the NAFTA, I don't think there would be any difficulty getting the NAFTA through the Canadian Parliament, even if we don't finish it until after the Canadian election in 2019. Because both the major Canadian political parties are strongly supportive of this agreement, and even our Socialist Party, as I said, while they might vote against it in Parliament, basically they don't want to see it disappear either. I would like to end this. I look forward to the questions and answers, but I'd like to end because I read the article in the Washington Post yesterday, I guess it was, by President Zedillo, and I thought it's an excellent article and very well written. I could subscribe to what he said almost exactly. I'd just like to quote two sentences from it. What the U.S. government seeks is not to modernize the old NAFTA, but rather to get an agreement that would destroy trade and investment among the three North American partners. It perversely aims to get Mexico and Canada's seal of approval to carry out the demolition of the most successful undertaking ever of mutually beneficial economic cooperation in the Americas. To remind the words, I think that's where you found those words, Marianne. So I would say, I think we should be trying as hard as we can to reach an agreement. But I don't think we should agree to a bad agreement. It would be better to have the Americans decide to withdraw from NAFTA than to subscribe to a bad agreement, which would not stand the test of time either, would not be durable over the long term. And of course, bad as it is, if we were to lose the NAFTA in that way, Canada and Mexico would remain parties to the NAFTA, and I suspect we'd be delighted to have the United States come back under the appropriate circumstances to rejoin the club. And of course, we also have the WTO, which we didn't have when we were negotiating the NAFTA. It's obviously not as good as the NAFTA in a number of respects, but it is there. However, we also have to worry about where the Trump administration is with respect to its it's belief in that. And you know, we could see that under threat as well, which I think is another reason why Canada and Mexico really have to stand tall in this negotiation, because it has to be, we have to make it clear to the Americans that we're going to stand up for good quality trade agreements, and we're not prepared to operate on the basis of a constantly diminishing standard of behavior in international trade law. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, John, for your very clear presentation. And now we have from Mexico, Jaime Serra, of course.
Gracias, Luis. Thank you. Well, let me first thank COMEXI for this initiative. It's great. And thank Carla and John for being here in Mexico. It's great. We were together last time in Minnesota talking about this issue, the three of us, and it was lots of fun. Things are getting a bit more complicated, so it might not be as fun. But what I decided to do is I distributed, no, it's a different thing. I distributed a one-page handout that, if you have access to it, would be useful, because it's the talking points I used in a briefing in the U.S. Senate in January, at the end of January, where I was invited to have this discussion together with Prime Minister Mulroney and Ambassador Wayne from the U.S. into Mexico. And it was actually a good meeting in the Senate. Probably you are saying these things in a funny way, that the Democrats are supporting now NAFTA. But what happened really in that meeting was that all of the senators, except for one, and there were around 15, 16 senators, were in favor of NAFTA. And actually, the Democrats that were in the room were in favor of NAFTA because they wanted to be against Trump. So it's a paradoxically speaking, it's a situation which we could use to really improve NAFTA, but with the consequences that we need as a region. And I'm going to refer to 5 issues only to give support to the concept that what we need is a non-protectionist modernization of NAFTA. Not any modernization would do it. You have to make sure that it's a non-protectionist. And I want to make my point by referring to 5 issues. The first one is what is happening in the world trade arena. And what you see there is basically that more than half, the largest proportion of trade flows take place now under the rules of regional agreements like NAFTA. When we negotiated NAFTA, we had something like 42 agreements registered in GATT, then in WTO. Today we have almost 180, which means that things have changed dramatically. And for countries to decide to abandon their natural region are really going against the dynamics of world trade, period. So if the Americans insist and they don't want to belong to NAFTA, they are really going in the wrong direction. But what we are seeing, which is pretty obvious, pretty basic. I mean, regions tend to be more competitive than individual countries as long as their economies are complementary. And if there is a region in the world where the economies are complementary, is NAFTA. So that's one point that it has to be on the table for the negotiators to realize that dropping out of NAFTA would really go against the direction that world trade has taken place over the last years. The second issue I'd like to raise is the degree of integration that has already occurred in North America. And if you look at the graphs, I'm not going to bore you with the graphs, but when you look at the graphs, you'll see that I built a little index of integration of the economy, and what happens is that it's almost exponential growth. Carla was giving some numbers that show that. And there are only 2 events since NAFTA was implemented in which integration went down. One was China joining the WTO, and the second was the Lehman Brothers. Very possible, to identify those 2 events. So now we have to wait to see the Trump effect. If that is going to be a little decline or it's going to be a major decline. My feeling is that the way NAFTA is built and what has happened, the Trump effect could be very damaging, but at the end of the day, the dynamics of the integration will prevail over time. Of course, we should help that integration to go on, But when you look at what has happened, and Carla was referring to this, first of all, it has been an integration that has been market-driven. I have to say it. Not many politicians or regulators were supportive of NAFTA once we finished the negotiation. Actually, people sort of took distance from NAFTA. And in spite of that, the integration has been very, very strong, which means it's market-driven, and that should be something that we need to keep in mind. The second one is that not only the integration has taken place in terms of flows in trade and investment flows, but there has been a macroeconomic convergence in the region. Mexico now has inflation rates that are quite similar to Canada and the US, have interest rates that are not that different, and our peso behaves vis-a-vis the American dollar very much like the Canadian dollar behaves. The volatility of our exchange rates is very similar. And all of these phenomena give a tremendous certainty to investors. You remember when in Mexico we used to have 3-digit inflation rates, investors would think twice about investing on us. Now that we have this sort of a convergence in all these short-term issues that are very relevant for the investment decisions, things are happening in terms of that. And those things could be lost very simply with the wrong policy in the US. And I'm afraid that's one of the risks we're suffering right now. Economic cycles have integrated as well. Now, I used to remember, I don't have the numbers here, but before NAFTA, the correlation between industrial GDP in the US and industrial GDP in Mexico was around 20%. Today is more than 60%. They very much go, the economic cycles very much go together. And that also helps to make decisions over the long term. And then finally, basically, and Carla was saying, the trade agreement that we built 25 years ago was a typical trade agreement. What do I mean by that? Well, basically rules for trade and some investment flows, and it was, I agree with you, sort of at the border, at the very front, it was a leader type of agreement. But what has happened over the last years as well is that we have changed the paradigm of that trade relationship between the US, Mexico, and Canada. Carla was saying that we are not only selling each other and buying from each other, but that we are producing jointly. And that changes the whole perspective of what NAFTA does. And if you do not accept that, like I am afraid the current administration in the US has not, you don't realize that what NAFTA does to the US and NAFTA does to us countries, it makes us much more competitive vis-a-vis other regions in the world. So the fact that the world is moving in the direction of regionalism, the fact that integration has gone and now we are producing jointly, should open the eyes of the negotiators, above all in the US, that affecting NAFTA or putting obstacles to the NAFTA rules would attempt against the competitiveness of the region, and particularly against the competitiveness of the US economy. And that is not easy to convince when people are so obsessed with trade deficits. And I think Ernesto refers to that in his article that he published yesterday. Because when you look at what happened is that the trade deficits are not fixable with trade policies. The trade deficits are fixable with fiscal policies. And the Americans are moving into a larger fiscal deficit, which is going to turn out into a larger trade deficit. And so if we were to accept any measure of the success in terms of trade deficit of the Americans vis-a-vis Canadians or Mexicans, because the trade deficit of the Americans is going to go up, because their fiscal deficit is going up. And that is absolutely essential to be put on the table. Now, this new paradigm, I call it the scrambled egg effect, and I really hope that that is the case. And that is that, and I mentioned this to the senators, and that is that once you scramble eggs, it's very difficult to go back to the original condition of the egg. Probably Mr. Trump can do it, I doubt it. But that scrambled egg is already happening. So I am optimistic about the long term of the integration, although I'm not optimistic about the current negotiation. Now, what happens when we hear this proposal for the auto industry, where they want to introduce wage levels for certain parts of the car and 40%? is first of all, incredible. It's a Soviet policy, but comes out from Washington. And I mean, just think about for a minute. And there are two rules for public policy. First one is that it has to be simple enough so that it can be enforceable. This thing that they want is impossible to enforce because, you know, it's basically absurd and introduces distortions that are very damaging to everybody. What the U.S. government has to understand is that our younger population is a plus, not a minus for the U.S. If you look at our demographics are pretty young compared to the U.S. and to Canada. So Mexico has abundance of labor and is an essential factor for being competitive. The Americans have abundance of capital as well as the Canadians, and we complement each other. So instead of discussing about building walls and establishing very nasty migration rules, if they have the vision to create a system where labor mobility, circular labor mobility could be incorporated in the region, the competitiveness of the U.S. economy and the Canadian and the Mexican would increase dramatically. That is actually happening, but not legally. So it's up to us to do it, to make it legal and make it much more efficient. The other element for competitiveness, and Carla mentioned already, is energy. Mexico has gone through a very major energy reform, which now allows us to make sure that the continent has, or the region has, very competitive prices of energy. Today, for instance, gas is much cheaper here in Mexico and in Canada and in Mexico and in the U.S. than it is in Europe or in Asia. So we have a tremendous possibility there to be competitive on natural gas, which is an essential input for manufacturing, which neither the Europeans nor the Asians have. So that's the other thing, that dropping out of NAFTA for the Americans will be lost, sadly. Of course, transportation helps us because we are neighbors, and that's a nice advantage. And the thing is, any protectionist measure that is introduced by just having a negotiation with the 7 poison pills that they have in mind would really attempt against the competitiveness of the region. And attempting against the competitiveness of the region means it's attempting our own competitiveness. So NAFTA should stay as a rules-based agreement, no managed trade. It should be a mechanism to increase our competitiveness, not to decrease our competitiveness, and that is something that is not properly understood, or at least in the American proposals is not properly incorporated. And there is an issue that I think we need to raise publicly and clearly. If the Americans don't feel comfortable competing with the Chinese, the worst thing they can do is to step out of NAFTA, because NAFTA has given them an edge of competitiveness to compete with the Chinese. Even if the Chinese are considered a non-market economy, it's clear that NAFTA provides very important elements for the U.S. economy to be competitive vis-a-vis China. And I know that it's diplomatically not very smart to refer to that, but it's about time now, because we have only a few weeks before we finish this. And let me just say one thing. When John Weeks was telling me at lunchtime, when we were negotiating NAFTA, we talked to the Canadians about the possibility of doing a trilateral meeting, a trilateral agreement. And we proposed that to Prime Minister Mulroney, and he said, no, I just went through elections, and this was one of the main issues, I don't want to do that. So we said, fine. So we started talking and so on. And then with a week to go for our first ministerial meeting, Carla, I received a phone call from David Winfield, the ambassador of Canada in Mexico, who now lives in Mexico. Wonderful man, and said, Mr. Minister, I'd like to talk to you. Said, I'd be happy to talk to you, Ambassador, but when I come back from our first ministerial meeting, because I'm pretty busy preparing for that. And he said, no, I need to talk to you today. And we had a week to go. I said, okay, so come to my office. I said, well, I just want to tell you, this is a message from Prime Minister Mulroney. We want to be part of the negotiation. So I said to myself, these Canadians want to be party poopers. They don't want us to have an agreement like they do with Americans. And so we wrote a letter. You must remember, Carla, because I talked to you about that. I said, well, what do we do? How do we protect ourselves from this Canadian initiative? And we decided to write a letter, which is a peculiar letter, must be in the archives of NAFTA, saying that, that the negotiation was going to be among three parties, but in case one of the parties didn't want to go on, all of the agreements reached to that point would be kept between the two left parties, the two parties that were still negotiating. Well, what is happening now is that the Canadians and us are much more clearly in favor of a NAFTA that is a modernized NAFTA, but not a non-protectionist NAFTA. And actually, when you think about what's happening in the world trade, the three of us are on the same side of the table. And the attitude that Lighthizer has, or that Trump has, is not. That's not it. They see us on the other side of the table, when actually we should be on the same side of the table, because we need to complement each other and to keep on growing together as a region. Let me finish just by saying, and then opening up a Q&A session, by saying that we have an opportunity to improve NAFTA seriously, and that I believe, and I have said this several times, that if it's not a protectionist approach, which I doubt would be the case, I think that the Americans are entering into a protectionist era, and they want to introduce some of these issues in our NAFTA agreement, among other things, to give us a signal to the rest of the world, which is a huge mistake, again, because now we are the same region, we have scrambled eggs. But if the proposals they are making, like the sunset clause that you mentioned, or the elimination or create optional mechanisms for dispute settlement, all of those things are going to attempt against the negotiation and the modernization, the one that we need, that is a non-protectionist modernization. If time, and Luis said that at the beginning, time cannot be the driver of substance. Substance has to be the driver of timing. And I'm afraid that if we don't send that signal clearly, loud and clear to Washington, to the negotiators, we could be running, because of political reasons, into the temptation to accept things that would be a big mistake for the region. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jaime, for those for the presentation. We'll go to the Q&A now among ourselves, and then we'll open up to the rest of you. So begin to prepare your questions. Take advantage of the cumulative wisdom that we have today. Carla mentioned that there is rising nationalism and populism in the U.S. Well, you are not alone, unfortunately. We also have some of that in Mexico. John mentioned that for the new NAFTA to happen, we need it to be win-win-win. But Donald Trump and Bob Lighthizer insist that the U.S. has to win because they need to stop losing. And I was thinking that we could use some of Trump's phrases to promote investment in Mexico, because he says things like, every time we compete with Mexico, we lose. Mexico has such good firms that Americans cannot compete against them. It's of course all false, but I mean it's flattering, no? And then he says things like, well, Mexico has the best trade negotiators in the world. Jaime Serra has that framed in his office.
On my bed.
And then when Jaime mentioned that the rule of origin that Lighthizer is proposing is Soviet, I was thinking that we'll end up producing Ladas in North America, as the Soviets
the Russian cars.
You know, this idea, for instance, that Lighthizer put on the table, that the internal combustion engines or the transmissions have to be for North America at 75%. In 10 years' time, there will be no transmissions and no internal combustion engines. So this thing that he wants to defend the cars of the past, as opposed to have North America set the standards for the cars of the future, is completely misguided. Let me begin the question to John Wicks. John, many people think that Canada would like to drag the negotiation as long as it can. That that is the best strategy. That finishing up now is not feasible, not a good idea. Do you think that is the case? Is that advisable?
No, I don't. And indeed, I'm not surprised by the question, though, because I've heard it before, including from your ambassador in Ottawa. But I don't really know where this comes from. I mean, I think, you know, Canada has come up with a number of creative ideas, too, in this negotiation, including at the January negotiating session. Was that the one in Mexico? No, in Montreal. Where we put some ideas on the table about how to approach the rules of origin in the automobile sector, which sort of helped move that part of that discussion forward, which is maybe the only part of the negotiation where there's actually been any movement or any real intense negotiation at ministerial level. I think that some people could possibly have the idea that Canada's dragging its feet because we've been reluctant to, you know, tell the Americans exactly what we'll do on dairy or intellectual property or the de minimis in terms of customs duties when you buy something on the internet. But I think, you know, we have some flexibility that we'd be prepared to exercise. But you've got to look, as I said in my initial remarks, at when do you do that? You can't really start negotiating with yourself by saying, in fact, it's dangerous negotiating with yourself. I went to the Museum of Anthropology yesterday here, and we had a very good tour, my wife and I, and we went to the Aztec room, and we learned that Moctezuma tried to deal initially with Cortez by giving him a lot of gifts. And as you would know much better than I, it didn't work out very well. So I would say, you know, there's something here. I was thinking to myself as I was listening to this, maybe we should be bearing this in mind as we negotiate the NAFTA. But so no, and you know, this uncertainty being created by the impasse in the NAFTA negotiations and by the uncertainty about whether the Americans are going to pull out and whether we'll be successful and what kind of agreement it will be is having a negative effect on the Canadian economy right now. And the governor of the Bank of Canada, in his most recent statement when he was looking at what to do with interest rates and did a press conference so on, made this point very strongly. So there's absolutely no interest from a Canadian point of view in dragging our feet on this. We would like this to be over as quickly as possible and return to a situation in which we have predictable trade relationships within North America. But we're not prepared to do that at the expense of having a really bad agreement, because to create a really bad agreement would be a worse situation than the current uncertainty. And I don't think it makes any sense for us to try to terminate the uncertainty by saying, well, we will pull the plug. I mean, for one thing, that makes, you know, it makes no sense at all. Because right off the bat, of course, we'd lose our relationship with Mexico, which at least we would retain that if the United States withdrew from the NAFTA. So, no, Canada's not dragging its feet.
Well,
and Chrystia Freeland, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, who's conducting these negotiations, would like nothing better than to bring this to a conclusion and to go on with other things. And in fact, I thought that she's quoted in the Canadian press yesterday as likening, she was asked how long is this going to go on, and she said, if you don't mind me using a personal analogy, this is, the midwife told me when I was giving birth to one of my children that each contraction of labor pains will bring you a bit closer to the delivery of the baby. And she said, I'm beginning to think that there's a resemblance between that and trade negotiations.
I mean, I think it goes without saying that Chrystia Freeland and Ildefonso Guajardo have done a tremendously positive job for Canada and Mexico, and also for the US, by the way. Carla, would you care to comment on the politics of the NAFTA 2.0? Is it viable in the US Congress? Do you think this Congress might vote positively on an agreement that we might reach with the US? Could you also comment on the so-called NAFTA ultimatum by Lighthizer? I mean, Lighthizer has said that he has an audience of 1, but I mean, there will be 535 people voting for the agreement in the House and Senate in the US. Can a coalition be formed to make it a reality politically in the US?
Well, the negotiations are possible to come to a good conclusion. The politics are challenging, but in fact, the politics have always been challenging on trade agreements. The original NAFTA did not get through our Congress with an overwhelming majority. It was a very few number of votes, and those votes were swept together by constant and hard work by people outside of Congress explaining what the benefits were of moving forward and capturing this agreement and what the detriments were for not getting the agreement at all. And that's exactly what we have to do today. Interestingly, the Democrats in Congress sound more positive toward trade than, say, a decade ago. And the Republicans less so than a decade ago. But out in the hinterlands, it depends really on your sector. And where the best contacts have been made is at the local level, the Rotary clubs, the mayors, and because they have a voice in talking to those who are running for election. Much greater sound bites come low level up than high level down. And I think that the deal is doable, but it's not done. And it's going to take a lot of work. And a lot of constant work by people who say, as an agricultural producer, I'm going to lose. This whole region is going to lose. If you vote against this, it's going to be disaster for you. That message resonates up, and we have to do a better job of it. So we got the data. There's no question that the NAFTA has been positive to all three countries economically and as a matter of strategy. If you go back to 1990, Mexico and the United States didn't work closely together on border issues. Today, we share intelligence. We're absolute partners on these issues. And there's so many things that we wouldn't have gotten accomplished without this strategic bond. So we got to get out and work, all of us.
Well, Carla, what about this idea that Lighthizer will send at the same time the package to the Congress and the letter of withdrawal under Article 2205? Do you think that's politically feasible?
Lighthizer will say, I'll send you the NAFTA, new NAFTA, but also the...
Yeah, there's been a lot in the press about the administration suggesting that maybe the way they'll end this is to negotiate an agreement that they want. Now, of course, that assumes that you get Mexico and Canada to sign off on the agreement. But there will be some things in that Congress has said, you put that in that agreement and you don't have my vote. And there's a long list of those things. And so there's talk about, well, I will just submit to you, this will be, I am pulling out of the NAFTA, and that will be the agreement that you think you don't like. Take your pick. Do my agreement or nothing. So-called my way or the highway. I think that would set the Congress on fire. And if anything were to make it angry, this would be one of the top things. And in addition, the fact of the matter is, if the Congress says, okay, we picked the highway, we're going to stick with the old agreement and you go ahead and pull out. But 24 years ago, you passed legislation that we have power over. taxes, tariffs, economic issues. You can deal with the diplomacy, we deal with the tariffs. So those stay in. Problem with that, for all of you and for us, is the uncertainty. You don't know what the rules are. And if you don't know what the rules are, it really stays your hand in terms of investing and trying to have a good trade relationship. So, bad idea.
Jaime, President Cedillo wrote in the Washington Post yesterday that Mexico and Canada should not cave in to the demands from the U.S., that it would be better to have no agreement. How urgent do you think it is for Mexico to close the negotiations in light of the comments made by John Weeks, the pressure on the peso, the lack of investment, and a potential win by López Obrador on July 1st?
Well, I fully agree with the concept. I don't think that we should cave in because of reasons of the short term. Basically, what the situation is putting us on is a trade-off between short term and long term. So if in order to get an agreement in the short term, we need to sacrifice the next 10 to 15 years with absolutely absurd rules, I think the damage to the Mexican economy is going to be much higher. So I think our negotiators should insist that the substance drives the timing and not the other way around. And that has potential consequences, but I think that the consequences for the short term are less damaging than accepting something distorted, managed trade, protectionist measures per sectors for the next years and so on. Because if we do sign an agreement with all those restraints, by the time we have a chance to change it and to bring it back to the U.S. Congress and reopen the whole thing, it's going to pass, several years. And the damage to the competitiveness of the Mexican economy and therefore of the whole region could be very, very serious. So my advice is stick to the non-protectionist modernization of NAFTA. If any measures are considered to be protectionist and they are asking us to accept them in order to close the deal, I think that would be the wrong idea.
Let me ask two questions to the three of you before we go to the questions from the audience. Question number one is, the U.S. has announced that under Section 232, import duties might be imposed on steel and aluminum on June 1st. Assuming we don't conclude the negotiations of the NAFTA between now and June 1st, how would Mexico and Canada should react if the U.S. imposes duties on aluminum and steel on June 2nd? Should we retaliate?
Your question is, how should you react? How should Mexico react? Ask Jaime. How should Canada react? Ask John. But the steel tariffs come out of national security. This is a very unusual approach because it's not a safeguard. It is under national security. And yet our Defense Department has not supported that it suffers from steel or aluminum. In fact, they use very little of both relative to the commercial side. And they were much more worried about how this action would impact our closest allies. Now, there's been an exemption, a temporary exemption for some allies waiting to see what they could negotiate, and there's been an exemption for Canada and Mexico depending on how the negotiations of the NAFTA come out. So, stay tuned.
Hi, John.
Thank you. Well, I agree with what Carla said, that this is a very unusual situation because this action is being taken really without actually declaring so in terms of notification to trading partners, but it's really being taken under the national security provisions. And if you were going to start justifying protectionist actions under the guise of national security in the World Trade Organization and the NAFTA and elsewhere, basically you'd completely undermine the trading system. So this is a very, very serious threat. And I think also, first of all, there's a sense here that this is kind of a shakedown. You know, that the Americans say to us, I shouldn't point at you, Carla, because I know it's but Trump points to us and says, you know, we're going to hit you with these duties unless you agree to a bad NAFTA. And frankly, hit us with the duties, please, because these duties are much less significant in terms of their economic effect than would be a bad NAFTA. So that's my first part of my answer in terms of a Canadian response. The second part is, I think we do need to retaliate. Because I think, given the uncertain legal ground in which the U.S. would have to argue this in terms of trade agreement rights, using dispute settlement would be next to useless. And we have to show that this is something we're not prepared to put up with. And to the extent that it's useful, show others too, like the Europeans, that we're prepared to do that. So that would be my answer. And Chrystia Freeland has said that, you know, if the United States put these duties on, we will need to respond. I forget her exact words, but the implications of reading it, what she said, is that we would take retaliatory action.
Jaime?
Well, this thing is so absurd, no? It's incredible. I was saying the other day in a conference that in order to evaluate risk, usually you use a normal distribution, you get rid of the tails, and the outcome is somewhere in the middle. The problem is that the current government in the U.S. is a tail. And that is very difficult to predict. But if you think a bit about the economic consequences of this measure, actually it helps us. Because it's going to increase the price of steel and aluminum in the U.S., and it's going to make the production of cars more competitive in Mexico, even more than it is now. So there is no economic logic whatsoever on this decision. The point is, if we retaliate because of the argument you're making, John, is how do we retaliate? And whatever we end up doing, which we did successfully when Beatriz was in the government, we retaliate with the issue of the trucks, and they did suffer with some of the measures that we established. In principle, the issue of retaliation bothers me very much because it is economically dumb. But I understand that politically probably we have to react. And in our current circumstances, if the 1st of June we get punished by the Americans, it would be very difficult for politicians in Mexico not to say, let's get them back, even though it hurts. But so politically speaking, I don't think we have too much room, but to do it, economically speaking, is stupid.
Last question for the three of you. We'll begin with Jaime and then go down.
Sure.
What is the probability we'll have the negotiations completed by May 30th?
You know better, Luis. I have no idea.
Carla, can we finish negotiations in the month of May?
I think it depends on the pressure that the electorate puts on the administration. I don't give it a high probability of getting it done, and you all know that you have the July date, but we have 195 days that complicate trying to use our current Congress in what we call the lame duck session between the December election and before the new Congress comes in. And every day that goes by means that you're losing that opportunity. So there's at least a 50-50 chance that we're going to be meeting again in 2019. But that would be good news rather than pulling out or a bad NAFTA.
Well, I think if it's going to be concluded in a quick time frame, it's going to require the Americans to show some flexibility in terms of their aggressive rebalancing proposals. And even at that, it would be difficult because there's still a lot of very complex issues which are left out there that need to be resolved. And frankly, it's not encouraging to see that the last time, 3 or 4 days ago, I checked in with our negotiators. They said that basically Ambassador Lighthizer wasn't giving any authority to his chief negotiator or any of the other subject leads the latitude to work towards concluding chapters in the NAFTA or making other suggestions about how to deal with the difficult issues. So if Ambassador Lighthizer wants to deal with all these issues himself, then I think it's very difficult. And you actually perversely start wondering, is he actually trying to run out the clock? Because he'd rather be in the situation of not finishing, which in some ways from his perspective is quite satisfactory, because it's created a lot of uncertainty about the investment climate in Canada and Mexico, and that's one of his objectives. And so if the negotiations went into a hiatus until early next year, he could probably explain that to the President as being satisfactory to the United States.
Well, it's also created huge investment uncertainty in the United States.
I'm glad to hear you say that.
Yeah.
I have trouble convincing...
I am not happy about it, but it is a fact.
I have trouble convincing Canadians that that's the case.
We'll do now a few questions from the audience. We'll accumulate 3 questions. Please be brief. Make questions, no comments. Beatriz, Andrés, Larry, y allá 2. Y empezamos con esas.
Thank you very much for your insightful comments. And I would like to ask you with regard to the last issue of retaliation, in which usually countries retaliate after a panel or dispute settlement body has decided whether there has been a violation of an FTA or to the agreements under the WTO. My question here is that I understand from your comments is that the countries will be willing to apply those retaliatory measures immediately, even if there hasn't been a dispute settlement body deciding on the issue. That's my question, which many have implied that would lead to a trade war in general. Because of this immediate reaction from the countries. That's my first question. The second is that if the U.S. continues to insist in its proposals that are counter to NAFTA, do you see, Carla, that Congress could deny the President the possibility of negotiating through the Trade Promotion Authority, which powers expire in July? Do you see Congress not renewing that for the possibility of negotiating NAFTA or other agreements?
Yeah, let's go to Andrés Rosenthal right here. So,
thank you. Excellent afternoon. Thank you to all. I have 3 questions or points that I'd like to make on the issue of the steel and aluminum 232 tariff menace. Peter Navarro has said very clearly that anyone who's going to be exempted after June 1st has to agree to quotas or VRAs in steel and aluminum, which obviously goes counter to NAFTA and counter to the idea of free trade. So what type of a reaction should we, Canada, Mexico, the Europeans, and whoever else is in the same boat? The second question is this issue of using withdrawal from NAFTA by President Trump as a means to pressure Congress and to send a message that it's either no NAFTA or his NAFTA, my way or the highway. The question is, do you think that the legislators are going to go along with something like that? I understand that yesterday or today, a rather large group of legislators sent letters to the White House saying that if Trump did that, he was going to be in trouble because there would be no acceptance of his national. And the third issue is just a question of Carla. Does the Iran pull out from the Iran agreement yesterday help or hurt? My impression is that having been able to fulfill campaign commitments such as that one, maybe it takes a little bit of pressure off the withdrawal of NAFTA.
yeah, we got Larry in the back.
Thank you very much. Jaime, John, hi. Carla, nice to see you also since DC. All right. And my question is, in your point of view, what is the positive highlights of what has been currently negotiated in terms of the countries?
One final question back there.
Positive.
Then we'll go to the answers.
I don't quite.
Thank you to all four of me for
the good points of the negotiation.
Articulated, logical, rational explanation of why that it's important to paraphrase Esther Hills, who said, if the population at large understood these arguments, they would have a very different attitude towards that, and it's our job to do so. But it seems to me that these decisions, these big decisions around the world are being taken more around tribalism and emotion than rationality and facts. Is there a way to better organize an effort around generating emotionally charged pro-net arguments than what we can do?
Okay, so the three of you go ahead and give answers to the
Why don't you start,
questions you like.
Well, I hope I have a list of the questions. The steel and aluminum tariffs are not under a safeguard which is provided by the World Trade Organization for security that a country may call upon when they see a given sector being in a very difficult situation. But it's temporary, generally less than 4 years, and you have to pay for it. That is the harm you caused. You're really buying peace for the sector that you claim is going to be demolished because of competition. That is handled. We didn't do it under those rules. We did it under the old 1962 Act, which deals with national security. I think it's going to be very hard to sustain that, and there will be complaints about it because the largest imports come from our closest allies. Explain to me how that affects our national security. And we still have, and we're using the process of negotiation to impose quotas. So if you don't sell us more than 100% or whatever the percentage is, then we will give you an exemption. That doesn't sound like national security. So we've never had this come up in trade parlance before, but I suspect it's going to trigger lots of antagonism. Now, someone asked about the withdrawal and versus, the bad agreement versus withdrawal. I think we talked about that up here, and that will cause a lot of friction in Congress that will spread to other issues. I hope that the legislative advisors to the White House are making that quite clear to the President. The suggestion that the Iran pullout is a good deal is not one that I support. We're about to start negotiations with North Korea, and the fact that we pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, I think, makes the mountain higher for getting a negotiation with North Korea. But I think you hinged your question on, does that put more pressure on the NAFTA negotiators? I don't think so. We seem to be developing a reputation from pulling out of a multitude of agreements. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Paris Climate Agreement, if we do the NAFTA agreement, the Iran agreement, it's quite a long list of serious issues. How that would help the NAFTA negotiation eludes me. Nationalism is an emotional issue, but it's growing because I think that technology has moved ahead so rapidly that we have yesterday's remedies for tomorrow's problems, and we simply have to train our workers who are unemployed to take the jobs, and they can't take them with the knowledge that they have. It's a big problem in the United States. We do need to have a better educational effort, and retraining, lifetime learning is going to be required. It's no longer going to be the economy of the hand so much as the economy of the mind. And we've got to deal with it and deal with the technologies that are coming that you and I don't even see today. And
the extension of TPA.
Oh, TPA. Trade Promotion Authority has some directives in it, and already members of Congress have complained that what they hear about the negotiations would not be compatible with the objectives. You know, with our divided form of government, where the executive branch has power to negotiate with foreign governments, and the legislative branch has power over taxes, tariffs, and economic issues. Trade agreements are not a treaty, they're an agreement. And so what happens here if we ignore, that is, the negotiators ignore what the objectives are of the legislative branch, it's going to have a negative reaction no matter what is brought back. And the rapport there is not, between the legislative branch and the executive branch, is not what you would hope for in any kind of shared responsibility. So it's hard to predict, other than tremendous ire, if the actions proposed are contrary to what were directed.
Jaime, John, would you like to comment on some of these issues?
Thank you very much. Yes, I won't comment on all of them.
No.
Let me say something to start with about the steel and aluminum, and the question about no panel. I think the problem here is if dispute settlement is pursued, say in the World Trade Organization, the American administration is basically going to say, this is a national security measure. We consider that it's unreviewable by the World Trade Organization, and we just won't participate in the panel. We're not prepared to have the World Trade Organization determine what is or is not in the national security interests of the United States. And frankly, I think to have them say that would probably be more damaging than just retaliating without waiting for the possibility of a panel. On the quota question and the VRA that Andres Rosenthal asked, I think Canada, I would recommend that Canada just say, no, we're not prepared to do that. We insist on having unrestricted access to the United States market for our steel and aluminum products, and I could go on a great length as to why. Let me comment briefly on on what are the highlights so far of what's been negotiated, because I think actually that's a very good question. Because I think that there's almost enough there already that the United States could claim that this has been a very good negotiation. Because a lot has been done on updating digitally how the NAFTA would work. You know, customs forms were on paper when we negotiated originally. Now it's all electronic. We've got, you know, electronic commerce hadn't been invented. And there are a number of these things where a lot of very good work has been done, and those chapters are either finished or very nearly finished, and that could be easily concluded. And you've listened to President Trump says the deal with Korea is a terrific deal. You know, we had this deal, it was terrible. You heard him talk about that. Now it's just wonderful, and it's all optics. There's nothing in it. There's a lot more that's already been negotiated in the NAFTA that could be seen to be important. And if you added on to that rules of origin, if it's possible to reach an agreement there, that could be portrayed, I think, as a very significant development. On the tribalism, and you know, I think it's an interesting question, and of course, how do you deal with tribalism? Very hard. I agree with what Carla said about technology. I'll make two observations. One is that, in a sense, what's happening with the manufacturing sector in Canada and the United States in terms of dropping employment but rising production is very similar to what happened in agriculture about a little over a century ago, where, you know, 60% of the workforce was in agriculture in about 1890 in Canada, I think, and now it's 2%, I think, and yet production in agriculture is much, much higher than it ever was at that point in time. That's the kind of thing we're grappling with, and we've got to be more upfront politically in leveling with voters about what the problem is, rather than participating in the trade bashing that's so easy. So easy if you're running for election to say the problem is all caused by foreigners, it's all foreign goods, foreign investment, whatever. That's and the other observation I'd make on the tribalism point is it's not, this is it's only the United States in a really big way that's attacking trade and trade agreements. There's the Brexit phenomenon, but that's a bit different, with actually the UK still struggling to say they want to be open to the world and negotiate trade agreements with everyone, including the EU. So it's a bit of it's not quite the same. It's not completely analogous to what's going on in the United States. But look at all the other things that are still happening. Trade agreements are still being made. Mexico and the EU. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, which a year ago looked as if it was dead. Everybody said it was dead. And due largely to the Japanese leadership, my God, who would have thought the Japanese would show leadership on this point? It's come to fruition, and it's been ratified by the Mexican Senate, and I'm sure it's going to be ratified in Canada, and we were skeptical about that for a while. So I was just reading in the paper this morning that RCEP, the Regional Cooperation and Partnership, Economic Cooperation Partnership in Asia, is coming close to, or there's a push on by the Chinese and the ASEANs to try and bring that to a conclusion. So people are still trying to make trade agreements. It's the United States that's out of sync on this with the rest of the world.
Yeah. Jaime,
yes. Very, very quickly, the most amazing technological innovation we experienced during the negotiation 25 years ago was the fax. You remember that? We used to send things by fax. Actually, I'll tell a little anecdote to, because the whole thing's a bit pessimistic, so I'll tell you a little anecdote. We took the initiative to write the original draft. I asked Guillermo Aguilar, who has left us, but he wrote it, and then I sent it to you by fax. You won't remember this because I still have it as a trauma. And then you said, for all the people here, negotiations is when you don't agree with certain parts, you put it in brackets. So I sent it to Carla, and I said, did you get it? Carla says, yes, thank you for sending us the copy. And says, and how many brackets do you have? Says, I have only 2. One at the beginning and one at the end. So I said, oh, this is going to be a tough one. This is going to be a tough one. So I think that one of the highlights of the negotiation is that we're entering into the internet stuff, which is absolutely essential. It's pretty sophisticated thing. So I think that is one positive one. And the other one that has not been mentioned, but I'm very positive about it, is the anti-corruption chapter.
Yeah, I would say 2 things on the questions. On the retaliation without panels, Beatriz is absolutely right. I don't think Canada and Mexico should violate NAFTA or WTO in retaliating against the US. But we have compensation rights on dishwashers, washing machines and solar panels on Article 802.4 of the NAFTA, ready to be used on June 2nd. And Mexico and Canada represent 75% of US exports of steel for the tariff lines they've chosen, and 45% for the aluminum. So we are the US's largest markets in the world for those items, and Mexico and Canada should use the compensation rights on that safeguard to hit the US exactly on the petitioners that promoted Section 232. And on the Mexican case, we should open an investigation, a national security investigation, against the illegal importation of assault weapons, against the suppliers of those assault weapons, the aluminum and the steel industries of the US.
Can I say something? We're preparing the trade war.
Well, we didn't begin it. Do we have time for more questions on this? Is it Mariana will tell us? Well, then if no more questions, then we thank you for your presence. We should also, of course, thank most of all John, Carla, and Jaime for spending time with us and sharing so much wisdom on the revamping of the North American project. Thank you very much.
Good work.